She had given birth 5 times. 3 of those children were still alive. She didn't have time to grieve the other 2. The fire had gone out in the night. The water bucket was empty, and her husband needed feeding before he left for the fields. This was not a tragedy in 1408 England. This was just a Tuesday. England, 1408, a kingdom technically at peace, ruled by Henry IV from the gilded distance of Westminster. The 100 Years' War smoldered across the Channel. The church held its grip on every soul from birth to burial, and in 10,000 villages across the English countryside, in places with names that history barely preserved, ordinary women woke before sunrise and carried the weight of a world that would never thank them for it. This is not the story of a queen. It is not the story of a saint or a martyr or a woman whose name survived in any document, any ledger, any church record. This is the story of the woman history forgot to mention, the one who kept everything running while everyone else got the credit. The fire was the first battle of every day. In an English January, cold moved through the walls of a peasant home the way water moves through cloth, completely and without permission. The home itself was one room. It was always one room. Timber framing packed with mud and straw, a thatched roof that leaked in the heavy rains, a floor of packed earth covered with rushes that were changed when they became unbearable and not a moment before. One window shuttered with wood, no glass, because glass was for cathedrals and the homes of men who owned things worth protecting. She found the flint in the dark. She always knew where it was. When your life depends on locating something without light, your hands remember what your eyes cannot see. She worked the ember patiently, feeding it dried grass and her own breath until the flame took hold. The fire caught. She didn't pause. There was no pausing built into this life. Water was next. The well was not close. Useful things were rarely close in medieval England. That was a luxury of wealth, and wealth was not something she had ever touched. She walked the distance with a wooden yoke across her shoulders, the empty buckets swinging, frost hard under her feet, and the sky still black above the tree line. She filled the buckets. She walked back. Her hands, already split at the knuckles from the cold, bled slightly when she gripped the rope. She did not think about this. She had stopped thinking about her hands years ago. The pottage went on the fire. Pottage was breakfast, and often dinner, and sometimes it was both at once. A thick boil of root vegetables and whatever grain had survived the winter stores, flavored with dried herbs from the garden she had planted and harvested and hung to dry herself in the autumn. Salt when there was salt. Meat, perhaps once a week, a small event in the calendar of an ordinary family. The children ate first. She ate what remained in the pot. This was not self-sacrifice as a concept. It was simply the mathematics of a world with not enough in it. She was not the only woman doing this. In every village across England, in every one-room home with a smoking fire and a leaking roof, women were doing exactly what she was doing at exactly this hour. They were a silent, invisible network of labor that held medieval civilization together from the bottom up, and they held it together without being asked, without being paid in any meaningful sense, and without any reasonable expectation that anyone would notice. The Black Death had swept through England 60 years before, in the 1340s, and had killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population. In its aftermath, labor had become scarce, and therefore more valuable. Peasants, men, had used this scarcity to bargain for better terms, lower rents, more freedom of movement. It was the beginning of a slow shift in the social order that would take generations to fully arrive. Women were part of this shift, but they arrived at it later and received less of it, and the gains were always easier to take back. In the fields, she worked the same hours as any man.
Harvest season did not recognize gender. When the grain needed to come in before the autumn rains destroyed it, every available body went to the field. Men, women, children old enough to bind a sheaf. She worked with a hand sickle from first light to last, cutting, binding, carrying. She was paid for this work, when she was paid at all, at a rate below what a man doing the same work received. This was not considered unfair. It was considered the natural order of things, which in the medieval world was another way of saying it was considered not worth thinking about. The rest of the year she spun. Every idle moment, walking to the well, sitting by the fire after dark, waiting for the bread to finish baking. Her hands were spinning wool into thread. This was not a hobby or a pastime. It was an industrial act performed in miniature, repeated thousands of times across thousands of households that kept England clothed. Thread became cloth. Cloth became the dress her daughter wore, the shirt her husband worked in, the blanket that stood between her youngest child and the cold that came through the walls at night. The spinning wheel was not a symbol, it was a weapon she aimed at winter every day for her entire adult life. She also brewed ale. This requires more than a passing mention because the brewing of ale in medieval England was a matter of survival that no one at the time had the scientific language to fully explain. The water drawn from rivers and shallow wells that sat downstream from fields where animals grazed, where human waste seeped into the ground, where the slow contamination of everything proceeded without anyone understanding why people kept getting sick, was dangerous. It killed children with particular efficiency through the invisible mechanisms of bacteria and infection that medieval medicine could observe but not explain.
Ale, brewed from grain and water that had been properly boiled in the process, was safer. It was what everyone drank. Men, women, children included. Every peasant woman brewed her own household supply, and most sold a portion of the surplus to neighbors for a few pennies. The women who did this regularly, the alewives, were fixtures of village life, as essential as the miller and the blacksmith, and considerably less celebrated. When the ale was good, her neighbors drank it without remark. When a batch turned, they remembered it for years. Childbirth was where the mathematics of this life became most brutal. 1 in 3 children born in 1408 did not survive to the age of 5. This was not a secret. Every woman who became pregnant carried this knowledge with her, not as a statistic, but as memory, as the names of children she had already buried. The delivery itself took place without men present, in a room made as warm and dark as the circumstances allowed, attended by a midwife and whatever neighboring women could be gathered. The midwife knew what she knew: herbal preparations, positioning, the techniques passed down through generations of women helping women through the worst hours of their lives. But she could not stop the bleeding when the bleeding would not stop. She could not save the child that came too early, or wrong, or silent. She could not do what did not yet exist to be done. A woman in 1408 understood that pregnancy was a negotiation with an outcome she could not control. She had made this negotiation before. She had survived it. She had held the results of it, some of them briefly, some of them long enough to love them deeply, and she had gone back to the field the following week. Because grief, in a world without margins, does not get the time it deserves. She carried the names of her dead children the way she carried the water yoke, always, and without being asked, and without ever setting it down. The law had a clear opinion about who she was and what she was owed. She could not own land in her own name in most circumstances. She could not initiate legal proceedings without her husband's authority. She was, in the language of both the courts and the church, a dependent, a person whose legal existence was defined primarily in relation to the men around her. If her husband died, she was entitled in principle to 1/3 of his estate. Claiming it meant navigating a court system built by men, run by men, and not particularly interested in moving quickly on her behalf.
The church framed all of this in the language of theology. She was Eve's daughter, the weaker vessel, prone to temptation, in need of moral governance. She heard this every Sunday and received it as the architecture of reality, because it was the only architecture available. But she also found in the church the only institution that acknowledged her grief. She prayed for her dead children by name. She confessed what needed confessing. In the ritual of Mass, in the familiar Latin she didn't understand but knew by sound, she found something that the fields and the fire and the spinning wheel never gave her, a moment that belonged to something larger than labor. History tends to look upward. It records the decisions of kings, the declarations of popes, the outcomes of battles that rearranged the borders on maps. These things matter, but they are not the whole story, and they never were. The whole story includes her. Every fire she rebuilt in the darkness was infrastructure. Every length of cloth she spun was industry. Every child she raised past their 5th birthday was the future walking. The farmer, the soldier, the priest, the mother who would wake before sunrise 30 years later and do all of this again. The civilization that historians study, that archaeologists carefully unearth, that we look back at with fascination and disbelief, that civilization was not built by the men who signed their names to things. It was maintained every single day, by women whose names were not written anywhere. Evening came early in an English January. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was gone, and candles were expensive, and so she worked by firelight until her body made a demand she could not negotiate away. She lay down on the straw mattress beside her children in the one room that was the entire physical boundary of her world, and she closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the fire would need rebuilding. She already knew this. Some part of her that never fully slept was already preparing for it. In 1408, an ordinary woman in England did not survive because she was exceptional. She survived because she refused every single morning in the cold and the dark, with bleeding hands and no audience and no record being kept, to let the fire go out. That was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, against everything this world threw at her, it was.